The Swati Nakshatra represents the precise atmospheric pivot in our cosmic architecture, the exact middle of the 27 lunar mansions.
Mm-hmm.
It is the celestial graveyard where the imperial ego goes to die, and the precise moment where the independent soul takes its first true breath of self-actuation.
Yeah.
So take a slow breath and just let that sink in for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Step out of the rush of the world and pull up a chair with us here at Café Karma.
It is really good to be back.
It really is. Just listen to the room for a moment. You can hear that faint, rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock right over there in the corner.
Yeah, and you can smell the old books.
Exactly. Those old leather-bound books mixed with this rich, warm aroma of the fresh melange sitting right here in front of you.
A proper Viennese coffee.
It really sets the tone. The vibe here is just so profoundly gemütlich,
Oh, absolutely.
Just totally cozy, comfortable, and deliberately unhurried. So we are going to intentionally slow our pace down today.
Definitely a good idea.
On the table between us, I've brought a pretty heavy stack of sources. Ancient Vedic astrological texts, some mythological translations, and modern astronomical charts.
That is a lot of material to go through.
It is, but our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize all of it, to exclusively map the archetypal and celestial blueprint of Swati. We're going to completely strip away all the modern jargon and the superficial fluff to really understand the hidden mechanics of what the ancients call the independent one.
I love that approach.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with a concept this massive?
I think the most grounded place to start is with the core identity of this constellation, looking at both the linguistics and the physical sky.
Right.
When we look at those early texts you brought, the word Swati itself carries some profound meanings. It primarily translates to the independent one or self-actuating.
Okay.
But in older interpretations, it's actually translated as the sword. And astronomically, if you step outside tonight and look up, Swati is firmly anchored to this brilliantly golden star we know as Arcturus.
Alpha Bootis, right?
Right. One of the brightest stars we can see from Earth. It acts as this luminous beacon of independence in the heavens.
And what I find fascinating in these texts is the sharp contrast in the symbols they used. On one hand, you have the sword, which is this cutting, dividing, fiercely independent force.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the coral, which is a complex structure that slowly calcifies deep beneath the ocean, totally hidden. But then right next to those, the primary symbol is a young, tender sprout swaying in the wind.
Yeah, it's quite the contrast.
How do a sword, sea coral, and a tiny green shoot even connect?
What's brilliant here is the paradox those symbols create, especially the sprout. I mean, a young sprout appears to be the most fragile thing in nature, right?
Yo, absolutely. You'd assume the first strong gust of wind would just
Snap it in half.
exactly, just destroy it.
But the profound secret of Swati, and why it pairs with the sword and coral, is its hidden resilience.
It makes me think of modern skyscraper engineering.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you build a massive, rigid tower out of solid concrete and a Category 5 hurricane hits it, that rigid structure will eventually crack right down the middle.
Because it just can't take the kinetic force.
Right. It takes all the pressure head on. So structural engineers don't build them that way anymore. They mathematically engineer these mega skyscrapers to sway.
Ah, I see.
They gently bend and oscillate with the wind. They yield to the atmospheric pressure instead of fighting it. And because of that, they survive the hurricane entirely intact.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to visualize it. And it perfectly captures the core lesson of this nakshatra for anyone listening. True strength isn't about standing like an immovable stone wall against life.
Right.
True strength is the ability to yield without losing your roots. It's resilience in motion. You bend to the fierce winds of change, but your foundation remains entirely secure in the earth.
I get the skyscraper analogy, and yielding makes sense. But isn't there a point where bending just becomes weakness?
That is the crucial distinction.
How do these ancient texts differentiate between yielding to survive and just giving up and being blown away?
To understand where that line is drawn, we have to look at the primary deity governing Swati, which is Vayu, the god of wind.
Okay.
But it is vital to understand that in the Vedic tradition, Vayu is not just a gentle breeze. Vayu is Prana.
Prana. We hear that thrown around a lot in yoga classes, usually just meaning breath.
Yeah, but it's much heavier than that. Prana is the unseen momentum of the universe. It is the vital life breath, the actual oxygen that fuels the fire of all existence.
Because fire needs oxygen.
Exactly. Without Vayu, the internal fires of your digestion, your ambition, your physical life, they cannot burn. Vayu animates absolutely everything. And because of that, It possesses an almost terrifying latent power.
So if Vayu is this terrifying force, how do the texts illustrate that? Is there a myth that captures what happens when that power is truly unleashed?
There's one myth that illustrates this perfectly. It's the story of Vayu getting into a contest of sheer strength with the Naga king, Vasuki.
The massive mythological serpent.
Right, so during this contest, Vasuki wraps himself tightly around a giant mountain peak, anchoring himself, refusing to let go. Vayu needs to move him. And he doesn't just chip away at the serpent. Vayu focuses his unseen power, intensifies the wind, and literally rips the entire mountain peak straight from its deep planetary roots.
Wow.
He hurls the mountain far away into the ocean, which, according to the myth, actually forms the Isle of Lanka.
He didn't just blow the snake away. He uprooted the whole mountain the snake was holding on to. That is a staggering level of force.
It is.
But if Swati is about the yielding sprout, how does this incredibly destructive, mountain-ripping wind fit in?
Because Vayu also provides a stark warning about hubris and a rigid ego.
Right.
We have to contrast the yielding sprout with another myth, the story of the boastful silk cotton tree.
Uh-oh. Boastful trees and myths usually don't fare well.
They do not. This massive ancient tree became incredibly proud of its size. It boasted that its trunk was so thick and its branches so rigid that it would never ever bow to the wind. It claimed not even a single leaf would fall, effectively declaring itself stronger than Vayu, stronger than the life breath itself.
Let me guess. Vayu hears this and decides to pay a visit.
Precisely. Vayu arrives and completely unleashes his power. He strips the tree bare, destroying its flowers, shattering its rigid branches, and humiliating it entirely.
That brings it right back to the skyscraper and right back to our own lives. Think about how that translates for a second. If you were listening to this and you are acting like that silk cotton tree, maybe in your career, refusing to adapt, or in a relationship rigidly demanding everything goes your way, you're setting yourself up.
You really are.
The moment you become rigid in your ego and boast that you will not bend, the wind of Swati will tear you apart.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this raw, chaotic power of the wind requires a refining force to be useful. You can't just walk through life being a hurricane.
And no, you'd exhaust yourself and everyone around you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is where the secondary deity of Swati enters the blueprint. Saraswati, the goddess of learning, wisdom, and music. She takes that immense primal breath of Vayu and refines it. She transforms the raw, howling air into intellect, into musical notes, into structured language.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
That perfectly explains why the texts say Swati individuals are gifted with clever speech.
Yes.
They take that raw life breath and turn it into brilliant communication. They possess this wonderful, disarming schmay.
Schmay, yes. The witty Austrian banter.
Exactly, that natural charm that puts people at ease. They use their words to navigate complex social situations just as effortlessly as the wind navigates through a dense forest.
And that effortless navigation leads directly into the specific celestial mechanic associated with Swati. The texts define this as Pradvamsa Shakti.
Okay.
Translated, that means the power to scatter and disperse like the wind.
Pradvamsa Shakti, the power to scatter. I have to be honest, scattering things just sounds like a purely destructive force, like making a huge mess.
It certainly can be, if uncontrolled, but fundamentally this isn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It's a necessary mechanism of transformation. Pradvamsa Shakti scatters stagnation. It violently disperses heavy, negative buildup in our lives so that new creation can actually take place.
Think about a time when everything felt totally stuck. You're in a job going nowhere, surrounded by toxic routines. You need that stagnation cleared.
Right.
It makes me think of an incredibly powerful leaf blower in late autumn. You have this thick layer of rotting leaves covering a lawn. The new seeds underneath are starving for sunlight, but they're trapped by the decay. You turn on that leaf blower and you scatter all that dead weight away. Or actually, think of a controlled demolition.
A controlled demolition is a very precise analogy for this energy.
Right. You have to safely bring down the old, rotting, condemned structure, scattering the dust and debris before you have the blank slate required to pour foundation for something new and beautiful.
Exactly. That is what Pradvamsa Shakti does. But managing a controlled demolition requires incredible balance and structural awareness. You can't just blow up a building without a plan. And when we look at the technical astrological blueprint, we see a fascinating planetary tug-of-war. Swati is located entirely within the zodiac sign of Libra.
And Libra is ruled by Venus.
Correct. A planet that demands diplomacy, social grace, and equilibrium. It desperately wants everyone to get along.
Okay.
However, the nakshatra of Swati itself is ruled by the shadow planet Rahu, which is a force of unconventional expansion, restless ambition, and fierce autonomy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That is a profound psychological friction.
It is.
Imagine dealing with this energy. You have Rahu demanding absolute independence, screaming at you to break the rules and rebel. But this Rahu energy is trapped inside a Venusian environment that demands perfect social etiquette and compromise.
Yeah.
It is exactly like putting a wild, rebellious rock star in a house governed by a strict, polite diplomat.
It creates a highly sophisticated internal architecture. Think about how the planets operate here. In Swati, the sun representing the imperial ego, the inner king, reaches its deepest state of debilitation at exactly 10 degrees.
Let's pause and think about that. The sun, the ego, is debilitated. It loses power.
Yes. It means an inflated dictatorial ego will inevitably collapse in this environment. The boastful silk cotton tree will fall.
The king is stripped of his crown.
Conversely, Saturn, the planet of the tireless worker, discipline, and delay, is exalted here. It finds its absolute highest power in the winds of Swati.
It's the ultimate cosmic reality check. The arrogant king is devastated, but the humble, disciplined worker is elevated.
Exactly.
This aligns so perfectly with Swati's animal symbol from the text, the male buffalo.
It does.
A buffalo in the wild doesn't charge around wildly seeking dramatic battles for its ego. It just has immense Sitzfleisch.
Sitzfleisch, that is the perfect word for it.
It just has the sheer endurance to sit through difficulties and grind it out over the long haul. When something gets in its way, it stubbornly brushes past. It doesn't declare war. It just yields when necessary and keeps walking forward.
That is the Saturnian influence perfectly expressed. And that steady endurance is fueled by the underlying guna structure of Swati, which is tamas, and sattva.
Hold on. Unpack those terms for us.
Yeah.
How should someone who isn't an expert picture tamas and sattva interacting?
Think of the gunas as the psychological building blocks of nature. Tamas represents heavy material reality, inertia, physical density. Sattva represents purity, clarity, and spiritual illumination.
Okay.
In Swati, the structure is 2 layers of tamas and 1 layer of sattva.
So you have a really heavy, dense foundation topped with a spark of light.
Yes. Imagine a dense material like the heavy earth holding the roots of the sprout. But deep inside that heavy material focus is this restless, illuminating spark of spiritual light, the sattva.
Right.
This specific combination creates what the ancient texts call divine discontent.
Divine discontent. That sounds exhausting, to be honest.
It can be. It's a perpetual, haunting feeling that no matter how much material success or social standing they achieve, it is never quite enough to satisfy the soul. The sattvic spark is always agitating them, whispering that there is something more.
And that makes total sense when you look at the rest of their chart. The texts say their purushartha, their primary goal of life, is artha.
Material prosperity.
Right. But their gana, or temperament, is deva, meaning godly or righteous. And their nature is chara, meaning movable, always in motion like the wind.
Always shifting.
So what does this all mean? How do all these wildly conflicting blueprints, Rahu's rebellion, Venus's harmony, the debilitated ego, exalted discipline, and that heavy base carrying a restless spark, how does all of this force the soul to evolve?
It forces the soul to realize through trial and error that true independence is not isolation.
Yep.
The friction you listed is intelligently designed. It makes them use their material success and diplomatic charm not for self-aggrandizement, but to clear the way for a higher truth. The divine discontent is actually a safety mechanism.
A safety mechanism against what? Complacency.
Exactly. It ensures they never become entirely complacent with just wealth.
Yeah.
The moment they get comfortable, that internal wind kicks up again.
It scatters the leaves again.
They are forced to keep moving, to keep scattering the illusions of the false ego until they find a purpose that aligns their personal breath with the universal wind of Vayu.
That is quite the journey.
It is, and it raises an important question, a paradox I want to leave with you.
Right.
If the absolute essence of Swati is the raw power of the wind, the Pradvamsa Shakti that scatters and disperses all stagnation, how does a person successfully harness this immense scattering power to build a solid, prosperous, grounded life on Earth without eventually scattering their own identity into the void?
That is the ultimate haunting question of the independent one.
Yep.
How do you wield the sword without cutting yourself? How do you become the wind without losing your form? We're going to leave you sitting with that thought. Just sink back into your chair here at Café Karma. Take a slow, deep breath in, feeling that prana. Enjoy the last warm sip of your coffee, and just listen to the quiet, steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Till next time.